Hi, everyone. We're going to wait just another minute or two while some more people join on. Thank you. Hi, everyone. We're going to be just waiting another minute or two just to get some more people joining. We're going to wait just another minute or two. We should have plenty of time to go through and take comments and go through a presentation today. So we're going to just wait a couple of minutes for people who are switching gears from different meetings. Thank you. Okay, I see the list of participants has slowed down, so I think we can go ahead and get started. It's 3:02. Welcome, everyone. This is the June meeting for the San Diego County APCD Warehouse Working Group, or what we call the WWG. And we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. So as always, before we begin, we have a few meeting announcements. Everyone except the presenter will be muted unless called upon by the host. We'd ask that you save your questions and comments until the end of each section that we will be presenting. And then finally, we'll be recording and posting the recording on the district's YouTube page following this meeting. And we'll also be posting a summary of the meeting, which we've done, which we now have up on our website as a reminder, just a one-page summary of kind of what occurred at each meeting. So if you haven't reviewed those on our webpage for the WWG, I'd encourage you to look at those as well. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of what we'll be covering in today's presentation. First, we'll take attendance and introductions of district staff and meeting participants. We'll then do a quick recap of the last meeting in May. We'll dedicate most of our time today presenting information on APCD's truck trip rate analysis. We'll then get into next steps, the next steps APCD intends to take in that same analysis, and then time permitting, any non-agenda items. Next slide, please. So now we'd like to take a few minutes for APCD staff to introduce themselves once again, and then we'll go down the list of participants as I'm seeing it here on Zoom. If you haven't done so already, please make sure your name in Zoom includes your affiliation or who you represent so we can adequately track who's here and from what organization. And so with that, I'll go ahead and get started once again. My name is Nick Cormier. I'm the Rural Development Supervisor here at the San Diego County Air Pollution Control District. And I will turn things over to Randy.
Hello, everyone. I'm Randy Consolation, Associate Engineer, Rural Development. Turn it over now to Kathy.
Hi, everyone. Kathy Kean with the APCD. I'm the chief of our Emission Reduction Strategies team, and I'll pass it over to Mike Watt.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Watt. I am one of the deputy directors here at the Air District, and I think Paula is the last APCD attendee, so I'll pass it over to Paula.
Thank you, Mike, and happy to be here this afternoon. I'm Paula Forbes, the Air Pollution Control Officer for San Diego.
Right, great. Anybody else from APCD before I move on? Okay, great. So I will now go through the list of participants as I'm seeing it here in Zoom. And I will go ahead and start. I see Andrew Aguilar from IEA. Angelica Carrasco from CARB, Ariel Fiddleday from CARB, Craig Benedetto from NAIOP San Diego, Christina Marquez. Christina, I believe you're with IBEW, correct?
Yes, I was just trying to rename my name. Yes, IBW Local 569. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you. I see, let's see, it's jumping around on me here. Ian McMillan from South Coast Air Quality Management District, Jack Monger from IEA, Caitlin Arduino. Caitlin, could you remind me of your affiliation once again?
Yeah, hi. I'm with Murphy Development Group. We're 40-year history in Otay Mesa industrial developer.
Great, thank you. Let's see, I see LaKenya Evans Hopper. LaKenya, could you state your affiliation, please?
Hi, it's Lakinia, and I'm with the EPA.
Oh, great, thank you. I apologize for butchering people's names as I go through this list, so my apologies in advance. I see Massey Hatch from IEA and MS Hatch Consulting. Matt Jones. Matt, could you state your affiliation, please?
Yeah, hi, this is Matt Jones from Innovative Cold Storage. We met last week.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Appreciate you joining.
Thanks for the invite.
No problem. I see Michelle Giron from Port of San Diego. And let's see, Nicholas Powell from Environmental Health Coalition. Rob Swanson. Rob, you're with the DOJ, correct? Just want to make sure.
Correct. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. I just wanted to make sure I got that correct. I see Tim Garrett from Sandag. Miguel Barone. Miguel, could you state your affiliation, please? Okay, no worries. We'll check in with Miguel in a second. Is there anybody else that I missed in going through the list? All right, great. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll now that we know what we're here, or who's here, we'll go ahead and get into our slide deck. So next slide, please. So the following is a recap of the last meeting held in May. The discussion items included an analysis of a warehouse study prepared by the Industrial Environmental Association, or IEA. It included an overview of the district's truck trip rate analysis, which we'll be going over in more detail today. It included a working definition of a warehouse for the purposes of WWG discussions. And then finally, a brief overview of comments staff received from APCD's Planning and Policy Committee when we briefed them on the WWG at their April 25th meeting. Some comments received at the meeting include local impacts cannot be shown in the IEA warehouse analysis because it uses truck count data at various points along freeways and not truck volumes within communities. Another comment was if the district prepared a similar analysis with more information, including data from CARB, to help the governing board determine the appropriate approach. The definition of a warehouse for this working group and rule is critical because the CoStar data set is likely capturing facilities that do not conduct warehousing activities, and whether the district conducted a survey of warehouse operators to request truck trip information. Next slide, please. As a reminder, here's an overview of the ISR timeline we laid out for the board in our June 2023 governing board meeting, as well as corresponding milestones. By summer this year, APCD is hoping to identify possible regulatory and non-regulatory actions to be pursued, incorporating feedback and information we received through the WWG, and then take any proposed recommendations to our governing board for consideration later this year or early next year. By May 2025, we are hoping to conduct a public workshop to present the draft regulatory strategy and continue outreach with affected stakeholders and communities. And by September 2025, we'd be looking to go to the governing board for their consideration of any regulatory strategy developed. Before moving into the main discussion topic for today, which we'll be spending almost all of our time on today, I wanted to briefly pause here to see if there was any questions or concerns about the timeline or any other questions before we get into kind of the meat of our agenda. If not, there'll be certainly other opportunities for discussion as we get going. So I will go ahead and turn things over to Randy, who will be walking through our truck trip rate analysis. And then I do want to thank Randy. He's been putting in a ton of time and effort into this analysis behind the scenes. And I just wanted to recognize him for doing that. And I'll go ahead and turn things over to him now. So Randy.
Thank you, Nick. At the governing board meeting in June 2023, the board directed staff to prioritize under-resourced communities and consider smaller warehouses, which are those with floor areas less than 100,000 square feet. The goals of the truck trip rate analysis are to address the board's direction, obtain truck trip data specific to San Diego County, estimate truck trip rates for warehouses. Truck trip rates are critical for estimating baseline emissions from warehousing activities. With baseline emissions, we can estimate emission reductions and cost effectiveness of proposed strategies. We can also estimate public health benefits from those strategies. Determining truck trip rates is so important because all these other estimates cannot be completed without them. Next slide, please. Before we discuss the truck trip analysis in more detail, here's an overview of some key findings. Using San Diego specific data, the data shows a strong positive linear relationship between warehouse square footage and truck volume. It is thus appropriate to use the data to estimate truck trip rates. Staff has attempted to account for unknowns in the dataset by incorporating various adjustment factors. An important thing to note is that the estimated truck trip rates presented are preliminary and may change if different assumptions are used after today. For warehouses with 50,000 square feet or more floor area, the estimated truck trip rates are generally within range of the rates referenced from other sources, indicating that the estimates are reasonable. However, for warehouses smaller than 50,000 square feet, the estimated average rates for the county are greater than 1.0 truck trip per 1,000 square feet, which is more than other referenced rates. Due to the degree of difference from other rates, staff has less confidence in using the estimated rates for warehouses smaller than 50,000 square feet. Additional data such as actual truck trip counts would be needed to verify those estimates. Next slide, please. This slide discusses the data sets used and an overview of the methodology of the truck trip rate analysis. The analysis began with developing an inventory of warehouses throughout the county using data obtained from a real estate information service called CoStar. Transportation modeling data was later obtained from Sandag. This modeling data of heavy-duty truck volumes used 2016 as the base year in support of Sandag's 2019 Federal Regional Transportation Plan. Things to note are that it is modeling data instead of actual truck counts, and the data is several years old. Nonetheless, it is the most recent publicly available data set that staff can utilize for this analysis. CoStar and Sandag data were then incorporated into a map created by the county's GIS department. Staff then looked at several warehouse clusters throughout the region and analyzed the truck volumes on street segments near warehouses to estimate warehouse truck trip rates. Next slide, please. We'll now discuss the analysis in more detail. Staff looked closely at the truck volumes in 10 distinct areas of the county. The areas shown in red include the following: Portside Community, International Border Community, Poway, Kearny Mesa, Santee and El Cajon, Miramar, Sorrento Valley, Carlsbad and Vista, San Marcos and Escondido, and Oceanside and Vista. Next slide, please. This slide shows a zoomed-in map of the Kearney Mesa area as an example. Sandag's modeled truck volumes are shown in different colors with a legend shown on the right. The truck volumes are the number of heavy-duty trucks traveling a particular street segment on a typical day in San Diego. The lines in bright red indicate the highest truck volumes of 1,000 heavy-duty trucks or more per day, which are typically on freeways with pass-through truck traffic. As you can see in the picture, Sandag's data include modeled truck activity data for freeways and highways, but most importantly for our analysis, also include such data for surface streets, which are in closer proximity to warehouses overall. Next slide, please. In the key findings slide, we stated that the data shows a strong, positive, linear relationship between warehouse square footage and truck volume. This slide explains what that means using a statistical tool called correlation coefficient. This is important because staff wanted to first determine if there is a relationship between warehouse floor area and truck volumes, and how strong that relationship is, if any. A correlation coefficient is a number between -1 and 1 that indicates the strength and direction of a relationship between variables. In other words, it reflects how related two or more variables are within a data set. Our correlation coefficient of 1 indicates a perfect positive correlation, which means that when one variable changes, the other variable changes in the same direction. A correlation coefficient of 0 indicates zero correlation, which means that there is no relationship between the variables. And finally, a correlation coefficient of -1 indicates a perfect negative correlation, which means that when one variable changes, the other variable changes in the opposite direction. So, does the data show a positive correlation, and how strong of a correlation is it? As warehouse floor area increases, do truck volumes increase proportionately along with them? Next slide, please. The County GIS Department assisted staff with searching the data for similar-sized warehouses located near the same street segment and the total daily truck volume for that street segment. The following are graphs for total daily truck flows versus total warehouse floor area for the county. The data is plotted with 5 warehouse size categories: 100,000 square feet and greater, 50,000 to 100,000, 25,000 to 50,000, 12,500 to 25,000, and less than 12,500 square feet. The graphs shown from left to right are for light heavy, medium heavy, and heavy duty trucks. All 3 graphs illustrate a positive linear relationship between warehouse floor area and daily truck volume. Next slide, please. In addition to the county, the correlation coefficients were calculated for the various clusters for the 3 heavy-duty truck classes, which are listed on this table. The correlation coefficients were calculated using 2 variables: warehouse floor area and truck volume. In general, the correlation coefficients for the clusters throughout the county were 0.88 or more, indicating a strong positive correlation between warehouse floor area and truck volume. The few exceptions with lower correlation coefficients are the clusters in Poway, Kearney Mesa, and Carlsbad and Vista, which are highlighted in red. Because the data shows strong positive correlations for most of the clusters and for the county, there is a higher degree of confidence in using the data to estimate truck trip rates. Next slide, please. Next step was for staff to calculate truck trip rates using 2 variables: the number of truck trips and the floor area in square feet of the warehouse buildings. A truck going in and then out of a warehouse would count as 2 trips. In this example, the truck flow is 50 trucks per day at a sample warehouse with 100,000 square feet floor area. Dividing the daily truck trips by the warehouse square footage, which is also divided by 1,000, gives a rate of 0.50 truck trips per day per 1,000 square feet of floor space. This is why 2 data sets were obtained and combined for analysis: the COSAR data, which provides the warehouse floor areas and locations, and the Sandag modeling data, which provides the number of trucks on specific street segments. Next slide, please. Even with the available CoStar and Sandag data, there are unknown variables at this time. Nevertheless, staff has attempted to account for these unknowns by incorporating various adjustment factors. While staff has information on 6,700 buildings throughout the county that potentially may be warehouses, the number of facilities currently conducting warehousing activities is yet to be determined. However, for the purposes of the truck trip rate analysis, staff looked at buildings in the CoStar data classified as warehouse, distribution, or refrigeration cold storage, and for single tenant occupancies, which together increase the likelihood of including sites that conduct warehousing activities. This results in the analyzed warehouse floor area being about 30% of the total floor space inventory. Also, portion of the truck volumes from the Sandag data that go in and out of warehouses is unknown. To adjust for this, staff used data from the Sandag 2022 Commercial Vehicle Survey to calculate the weighted average of vehicles that made visits from warehouses, which is about 13%. Staff then assumed the same portion of truck flow going to and from warehouses. And finally, while the Sandag data is modeled traffic flow and not actual truck counts, the models are calibrated using observed data to check for accuracy. This check of the model with observed data gives a greater level of confidence in using the model data. Next slide, please. Before we discuss the estimated truck trip rates, this and the following slides show truck trip rates referenced from 4 different sources for comparison. In 2013, South Coast AQMD conducted a survey of about 400 warehouse operators in their region. A total of 63 operators responded, which is a response rate of about 16%. This table lists the minimum, maximum, and average rates reported in the survey. The overall trip rate is for trips from all vehicles, including cars, and truck trip rate is for trucks only. The reported truck trip rates range from 0.05 to 1.76 truck trips per 1,000 square feet, with an average rate of 0.53. Next slide, please. The next set of truck trip rates for comparison is from a study prepared by the Institute of Transportation Engineers, ITE, called High Cube Warehouse Vehicle Trip Generation Analysis. The study was prepared in 2016 in support of South Coast AQMD's development of Rule 2305. The estimated rates for trucks and 5 or more axle trucks are for 3 warehouse categories: transload and short-term storage, cold storage, and fulfillment center. These rates range from 0.233 to 0.836 trucks per 1,000 square feet. Next slide, please. This table lists the rates estimated by South Coast AQMD when they developed the Warehouse Rule 2305. South Coast AQMD estimated rates for Class 4 through 7 and Class 8 trucks for 3 warehouse categories: those with floor area of 200,000 square feet or more, warehouses between 100 and 200,000 square feet, and cold storage facilities 100,000 square feet or more. The rates range from 0.12 to 0.75 trucks per 1,000 square feet. Next slide, please. Finally, the following lists the truck trip rates from ITE's Trip Generation Manual, 10th edition. With the exception of the rate for High Cube Fulfillment Center Warehouse at 1.37, the other truck trip rates listed on this table range from 0.1 to 0.64. Upon review of the truck trip rates mentioned on this and previous slides, almost all of the rates are less than 1.0 truck trip per 1,000 square feet. Next slide, please. Now that we've gone over truck trip rates from other sources for comparison, we'll now discuss the preliminary results of APCD's truck trip rate analysis. Staff calculated truck trip rates for the different regional clusters throughout the county, including the Portside area, International Border, other warehouse clusters in the region, and the county overall. This table lists the estimated truck trip rates for the various warehouse size categories for the Portside community. The columns with the orange text indicate daily truck trips per 1,000 square feet of floor area. The columns with the green text indicate the number of daily truck trips at an average size warehouse for a particular size category. The truck trips were calculated using the listed truck trip rate and the average warehouse square footage for each size category. So for example, looking at the first row in the table for warehouses 100,000 square feet and more, indicated with an arrow, an average 250,000 square foot warehouse would have about 38 daily heavy duty truck trips for that facility. The rates for heavy duty trucks range from 0.08 to 2.98 truck trips per 1,000 square feet. For warehouse sizes shown in gray text, the estimated truck trip rates begin to exceed 1.0 truck trip per 1,000 square feet, which exceeds the rates from other sources. Next slide, please. This table lists the estimated truck trip rates for the international border community. The rates for heavy duty trucks range from 0.46 to 2.92 trucks per 1,000 square feet. These rates are generally higher than those for Portside. Next slide, please. This table lists the estimated truck trip rates for the various clusters throughout the county. Note that these rates were calculated excluding the areas of Poway, Kearny Mesa, and Carlsbad and Vista due to their lower correlation coefficients. The rates for heavy duty trucks range from 0.29 to 1.99 truck trips per 1,000 square feet. Next slide, please. Finally, this table lists the estimated truck trip rates for various warehouse size categories for San Diego County. These truck trip rates represent the overall average rates throughout the county. So how do these rates compare to those referenced from the South Coast AQMD, the ITE study, and the ITE Trip Generation Act? As mentioned previously, almost all of these reference rates are less than 1 truck trip per 1,000 square feet. As shown in this table, the rates for 100,000 square feet or more and the rates for 50 to 100,000 square feet are less than 1 truck trip per 1,000 square feet. And as mentioned previously, for warehouses smaller than 50,000 square feet, shown in gray text, the estimated truck trip rates begin to exceed one truck trip per 1,000 square feet, which exceeds the rates from those other sources. Next slide, please. Now that staff has estimated truck trip rates, how will they be used? If the district is directed to develop an ISR, the truck trip rates could potentially be used as default values if actual truck trip counts have not been tracked or if that information is not available. The calculated truck trips would then be used to determine the level of requirements a facility would need to comply with. The truck trip rates will also be used to calculate baseline emissions for nitrogen oxide, NOx, and particulate matter, PM 2.5. Next slide, please. Before we pause for questions and comments, we'd like to go over the key findings of the analysis once more. The data shows a strong positive linear relationship between warehouse square footage and truck volume. Various adjustment factors have been incorporated to account for some unknowns in the data. For warehouses with 50,000 or more square feet floor area, the estimated truck trip rates are generally within range of the rates referenced from other sources, indicating that the estimates are reasonable. For warehouses smaller than 50,000 square feet, the estimated average rates for the county are greater than 1 truck trip per 1,000 square feet, which is more than other reference rates. Additional data such as actual truck trip counts would be needed to verify the rate estimates for warehouses smaller than 50,000 square feet. Next slide, please. We'd like to now pause the presentation to hear any questions or comments you may have on the truck trip rate analysis. We have some questions for you to think about. What aspects of the analysis do you agree with and find interesting? Are there any aspects you feel require more analysis or disagree with?
All right, great. Thank you, Randy. I know that was a lot of information we were throwing at you all at once. Fully recognize that. So we have the ability to go back and look at slides, and I posted a link to the presentation in the chat just so everyone has that so they could reference it on their own as well. But if there's any questions or comments, we'd love to take them at this time. I see a couple hands up already. So I think Andrew Aguilar from IEA was first, and then Caitlin Arduino, and then Tim Garrett. So Andrew?
Hi, thanks, Nick. So I actually have a few questions to kind of start off with. And I guess the first off, the transportation data, that's the SANDAG activity-based model data?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So that's kind of one of my first concerns, I guess, is that there was some email traffic going back and forth with Mr. Joaquin Ortega from SANDAG saying that at the time, and I guess it will depend on what version of the ABM that you have, but just that they discouraged using the data sets currently, that they have for their current model because of the growth forecast is quite different than what they're using now. Now, whether that's going to affect it because you guys are looking backwards in hindsight, it's hard to say, but that discouragement from using their data for this kind of gives me the first pause. The second question that I had was with respect to the coefficient correlation calculation that you did. Was the scope strictly for the warehousing areas, or did that include other industries as well that might have also had like a lot of truck traffic, for example, like big box stores, wholesalers, to that effect? Was there any way to kind of gauge the magnitude of this? Because I feel like there could be an opportunity for some noise to be thrown into that signal.
Yeah, so I'll take a stab at answering these questions, and if anybody else wants to jump in, go for it. But in regards to the first question, Andrew, you're right. There was that email that was from Joaquin at SANDAG about the use of the 2016 ABM data, which is what we were using for this particular analysis. This is data that we asked SANDAG for probably almost approaching a year ago. So it, at the time, that was the only publicly available data at that point. And we do recognize that SANDAG is working on an update of that data, and that was part of the, that was something they had let us know about, that as part of their new regional plan, they were going to be updating that information to account for new information as they usually do. Understandably that this process was kind of started when that was all still kind of relevant data. They are working on a new update of that data. There is some information that I believe is going to be trickling out soon and into the summer, and we'd be certainly looking at that data more as that is publicly released. If we do get to a point where there's a regulatory process as part of this effort, we'd be surely looking at updating this analysis, if this is the approach we're going to be taking, with more relevant data that would be available. One thing that we are fairly confident of, you never know until you see the numbers, but one thing that we are looking at in terms of this data is we think this data is probably a conservative analysis based on the truck activity that was pre-pandemic. Now that we're post-pandemic largely, and that trucking activity has kind of grown since then due to more deliveries being taken place, we think that it's possible that there could be more truck activity being shown in this new analysis that SANDAG's doing. We don't know for sure until we see it, but that's something we'll be looking at as we move forward. But for the purposes of today's analysis, that is the data that we'll be using. And then in relation to your comment about looking at the correlation coefficient, and if we looked at just warehousing spaces or other sources like big box stores, I believe our analysis was just looking at warehouse analysis or warehouse locations from CoStar at the moment. However, I think with this model, there's nothing that would necessarily, I guess, prevent us from doing something similar to look at other sources as well, with the methodology that we've developed. It would take some time to do that, and we certainly didn't do that on this round, but I think it's possible that we could potentially do something like that for comparison purposes at some point in the future.
Yeah, and I would recommend that, because we need to understand, like, you know, the activity with one sector of the economy here in San Diego relative to other sectors. So, you know, like, without other things to compare for magnitude and for reference, like that can be that 1,000 truck trips next to a warehouse could seem a lot, but it could be 10,000 truck trips next to, say, you know, a Costco or some other facility. So we need to know what scope of the trucks, or what size population of those trucks would even be captured by kind of the scope that we're trying to wrap the rule around. And the other part that also kind of has me concerned about the CoStar data, or with the methodology currently, is that we're developing a rate that's based off of these variables that are highly sensitive to what's being included within the population. So if the CoStar data is calling something a warehouse that, upon, you know, further review, isn't a warehouse, that's going to, you know, heavily skew your calculation at the end of that. And so it's just something that, you know, we really would need to take a lot of care to make sure that you know, whatever calculation you do come out to is going to be something that would, you know, appear to be representative. And without anything else to kind of reference against that, it can be pretty difficult to do. And I guess one other, you know, comment that I did have was with respect to, you know, if there are other tools that we could use outside of the CoStar data to kind of help identify kind of, you know, hand on a Bible businesses that might actually have some contact information on there. Surely there's something else out there apart from kind of relying on the property, a property sales list that can also have more details, as opposed to including a huge population. There has to be something we could pare it down to.
Yeah, thank you for the comments, Andrew. We'll, you know, I would kind of pose that also to the group as well. If there's other data sets that could potentially get similar kinds of data in terms of warehouse, you know, what's going on at particular warehouse locations, square footages, that sort of thing, we're all ears. We're not necessarily wedded to the CoStar data. However, this is the approach that South Coast used, and it's at the moment the best one that we found. But if there's other data sets available, you know, please send them our way. We'd love to take a look at them. So I will go ahead and pass the mic to Caitlin.
Hi, thank you very much. I'll comment. CoStar has a very large breadth of information. There's a couple other ones, but I would say that that's a really pretty good data set. I would say that you can drill down into specific subtypes of warehouses and or easily add retail into that subset. And I agree that that should be kind of a cross check to see what the level of truck traffic is compared to those other uses. My comment specifically has to do with one of the data set points. For instance, in the border area, they talked about the buildings over 100,000 feet averaging 225,000 feet, more or less. That is, I guess, a little strange to me, unless there were, you know, Amazon has a 4 million square foot facility down there. I would, you know, and then they have another, it's either 600,000 or 800,000 across the street. Beyond that, most buildings in Otay Mesa do not exceed 100, maybe, you know, there's a couple 200,000s that we've built, but it's a smaller market. So I was surprised to see that the average over 100,000 feet is 225,000 feet. So I'd like to see your data set. I mean, I don't know every single building in Otay, but certainly there's one building that was built, you know, within the past 20 to 30 years that was 600,000 feet, and that was a huge outlier. And then again, Amazon's come and built a couple huge buildings, but I would suggest that to get averages, if you're going to be using them, you probably need to throw out a couple of the outliers. So that stuck out to me as I was looking at that.
Yeah, thank you, Caitlin, for the comment. You know, we can certainly, and I think we've done this before with another organization. If you want, we can certainly pass along the CoStar data that we had. If you wanted to do a little bit more digging around in it, we can certainly pass it along. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
I
You
would
broke
love
up a
to
little
see
bit.
that. And I guess what's, I know we saw that you're using these to create correlations, but I don't know what the next step is. So I guess I don't know if it's what the benefit or negative is of the size of the building necessarily. Thanks.
Sure, no problem. We'll try and connect up with you offline to get that data over to you in terms of the CoStar data. Let's see. Tim Garrett.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Question on slide 13, I want to say it was. It's the, no, that's not 13, sorry. It's 16. Yes, the data gap slide. So when Randy was presenting those, are those just noted as like kind of like notes, or were these numbers included into the analysis? It was like a 30% floor area included as part of the calculation for the total warehouse footprint in term, were these used as you were doing your analysis? And same with the 13% for the truck flow.
Randy, do you want to try and tackle that one?
Yeah. Yes. The short answer is yes. These factors are intended to, for the first one, take the known whole universe of the floor area for all the warehouses that we have in our inventory and find some way to identify, without even knowing, which of these have actual warehousing activity. So we looked at two things. One is a building classification, which includes buildings that were classified as either a warehouse, distribution, or refrigeration, cold storage. And then the second piece that we looked at, again within the CoStar data, is tenancy. You know, is it a single tenant or is it multiple? And that's about 50%. So most for the building classification, that's roughly 60%. So if you combine the two, that's how we get to 30%. In an effort to identify of the total square footage, how much of that would be warehousing activity. Is that, you know, completely accurate? It's hard because it's an unknown. So it's our best guess at this moment until we can find a better factor. But that factor is intended to capture warehousing activities, to kind of basically lower the square footage that we're actually looking at. And to kind of Andrew's point earlier in his comment, he was talking about how much of that flow goes to actual warehouses or as opposed to a retail, and so on and so forth. And so that's where that 13% comes in. Again, all we have from the model data is truck flows, right? Truck volumes, the total amount in a given day, in a typical day in San Diego, on a given street segment, how many trucks there are, you know, light, heavy, medium, heavy, and heavy duty. But we have no idea as to which of those trucks, percentage-wise, actually goes to a warehouse. So looking at the 2022 commercial vehicle survey, there was a table in one of the appendix that stated, had a table that showed the percent of vehicles, whether the 0%, I think 25 to 50%, and 15 to 100%, and then how many of the surveys had those percentages, corresponding percentages. So with that information, I did a weighted average. So it wasn't in the data set in the survey itself, but it was just using that information to kind of figure out, okay, well, if these flows going to a particular business have about a 13% truck flow coming from a warehouse, I made the assumption of, okay, well, that same flow profile is going from the warehouse or back to the warehouse. So that's how I was able to, about all of the truck volume on a given street segment, I tried to focus on those that are going back to the warehouse, which is that 13%. And so it's an attempt. So think of it as, you know, water flowing through a main pipe, serving multiple homes. We have no idea how much that percent of flow actually goes to the homes. So this is like a percentage of that flow to try to capture, okay, these are the trucks going to a warehouse. So those are the two unknowns on that slide. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, those are great answers. Thank you. And just the question on the first assumption about the square footage, taking 30%, is it consistent with the other data sources highlighted in the presentation, like the ITE and the South Coast, to not use the total building total building footprint, but rather use the warehousing footprint as the basis for truck trips per square foot?
Right. So that's kind of difficult. The other sources look at gross square footage. So it doesn't really matter which percentage of the floor area is dedicated to warehouse and other. They're just looking at straight gross square footage of the building. So they make no distinction with that. It later comes into play because in South Coast rule, that determines which category of warehouse space the rule applies to. So say, for example, you have a 200,000 square foot warehouse building, but let's say more than less than 50,000 square foot is actually used for warehouse activity, then they could potentially be not subject to that South Coast rule. So that's kind of where it more comes into play.
Okay, thanks. And then I would just, I guess one thing to think about is just maybe since they are making the truck trip rate calculations based on gross square footage, that maybe you stick with the gross square footage for that purpose, but then use the 30% for analysis of different rules that are being considered. Just a suggestion. But yeah, thank you for the answers, and thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. We'll consider that comment as we dive further into this. Let's see, Michelle.
Hi. So thanks for sharing this study and conducting it. So I have a few recommendations, and my first is to prepare a report to document the modeling inputs, outputs, and analysis so that the working group can better assess the study and what went into it. And then I also think it's important to validate the study. And one way of doing this is by conducting traffic studies of a subset of the warehouses. I also think would be useful to survey building operators to determine if the study is appropriate to use for the truck trip estimations. And I also think it's very important, I echo previous comments, it's important to determine the actual number of warehouses and distribution centers in this population of industrial properties that you've assessed. I think that maybe sharing the list and allowing the working group to go through it might help. And there have to be other sources of data that may be available to APCD and not the rest of us, maybe sources with the County of San Diego, that databases that you have access to.
All right, thank you, Michelle. We'll consider those comments and trying to think about those a little bit more. We are, for reference, we are thinking about doing an updated report in regards to your comment on the report. We are thinking about taking a revised report to our board when we get there later this year. And so it was kind of our hope to bring in some of this analysis into that report. You might remember we had something called an ISR framework document. That was kind of the initial phase of this whole effort. I believe we'd probably be working on something similar to that in regards to this new data, new information that we found, as well as the comments that we've been receiving and the feedback we've been getting at the WWG. So that is on our to-do list to do.
Okay, thank you. And I know we have somebody from AQMD here, and maybe he can comment on whether the number of warehouses they looked at in the rulemaking actually was similar to the number of actual warehouses and distribution centers when the the rule was rolled out and people had to report to AQMD.
Sure. I mean, if Ian's willing, I see Ian's hand up. Jack, if you're okay waiting for a couple seconds while we wait for Ian, are you okay with answering that question? I don't know if you heard it.
Yeah, I think I did. I think the question, hi, this is Ian McMillan from South Coast AQMD. The question that I heard was whether or not the count of warehouses from the rule development analysis is the same as what happened as we're actually rolling out the rule. When we're still in the middle of phasing in our rule, we're just starting year 3, or I guess halfway through year 3 at this point. We're still collecting data on warehouses. I think it is definitely fair to say we did anticipate this going in, that some buildings might look like a warehouse from the outside, might be a warehouse in a database, but until there's some basic information reported, we don't really know to what extent there is warehousing going on inside that building versus manufacturing. One of the things that I think we heard from industry as well was that can change through time. That, with short-term leases, when I say short-term, 3-year, 5-year kind of leases, not uncommon in the industry, at least in our region, you might have manufacturing for a few years and then it turns into warehousing and then it turns back into manufacturing over time. So we do expect that there is going to be some variation, and we're seeing that bear out in some of the reporting that we're getting. But I would say overall the majority of the warehouses that are in our rule that we thought were going to be warehouses are in fact warehouses. Now then we're looking a little bit bigger, 100,000 square foot and larger. And in our region, that is, most of those buildings really are dedicated to warehousing. The one thing I'll also offer while I have the mic here, we're starting, one of the things that our rule does is we had in our rule analysis for trip counts that facilities needed to actually collect actual data and report that to us. And so we are getting that data in. We're, in earlier stages of auditing some of that data. But to the extent that we can share some of that, we'll see if we can do that to show, how does that reported data compare to, for example, the ITE study, which we helped co-fund along with NAIOP. And that study we relied on heavily in our rulemaking analysis. But we are collecting additional data now. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Appreciate it. Jack.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks for running through this today for us. I just have 3 comments. The first one is we spent a lot of time talking about the relationship between warehouses, size of warehouses and trucks, and I think what's missing from that discussion is also the emissions in those locations where the warehouses are. We've already seen through some of the data that Andrew's presented in earlier presentations that there's not a direct relationship between communities that are experiencing severe emission issues and where the warehouses are. And this is I think it's a misunderstanding. I think let me put it this way. I think there's an assumption from a number of our ABCD board members that there is a direct relationship. Where you find warehouses and trucks, you will find the most polluted communities in San Diego, and that's definitely not the case, or we sure haven't seen any data to convince us otherwise. So that's first comment. Second comment is, I can't imagine why we would want to use data from an agency that has said, don't use that data, that has advised us not to. I understand if the process was begun many months ago and before we were given that advice, but that is just, that's going to set everything back if we find ourselves relying on data that an agency is telling us they don't have any confidence in. So I know it's hard to find additional information that we can use in this analysis, but I think we need to commit to doing that and not to just saying, well, this is the best out there that we think's there. I think there's some other good information out there that could also be used. And finally, we have been mentioning off and on almost since this working group started meeting and talking about the definition of a warehouse. Until we really zero in on that, we're going to have trouble evaluating whether or not CoStar's information is valid because of how they define a warehouse. We've talked about how important of a process that was for South Coast. And in fact, many discussions have suggested that we use something very close to what South Coast has. But I think as long as that's wide open, and that doesn't really help restrict us to utilizing data that is really relevant to what we're trying to accomplish in San Diego with regard to the specific definition of warehouses we're trying to evaluate. So those are just 3 comments that I had today.
Yeah, thank you for the comments, Jack. At least in regards to the definition of the warehouse, I will say that you know, we did try to attempt to nail down, you know, what we are considering to be a warehouse for either for the purposes of a regulation or a incentive program, non-regulatory option at our previous meeting. I can't recall if you were on that one or not, but we do have kind of a working definition that we are proposing to use, and you know, we do go a few more steps into defining exactly what that is. You know, it probably doesn't go as far as probably a lot of what a lot of people probably want at this phase. However, since we haven't really taken a full approach of rulemaking or regulatory approaches, we still want to be a little bit nimble with that. However, there are a few key areas where we know we weren't going to be looking at in terms of saying in this particular situation, this is we don't think this is a warehouse. So there are a few examples that we went and included in that presentation that I would probably just call out a bit and just to remind folks of that we do have some of that available. And then I guess the same comment in regards to the data from Sandag. You know, we do believe that we are going to be probably getting some more updated data in the future. You know, we're using the best available that exists right now and was available to us at the time. And so, you know, that point understood, you know, in regards to that comment, but I guess I'll let my previous comment stand in regards to Andrew when I responded to that today, Andrew.
And Nick, if I can just add to going back to the definition of a warehouse, I think part of the challenge, and this may be what Jack's alluding to, is, you know, whatever definition we land on, it's difficult based on the CoStar data that we have to determine which of those facilities fit into that definition. And I think there was some discussion earlier about, you know, looking at other data sources that might be out there, whether or not they can help refine that to really identify whether warehouse A listed in CoStar would fall in under our definition of a warehouse or not. I think that is going to be a tough nut to crack. As Ian alluded to earlier, it sounds like at least in their region, you know, most of the warehouses that they had identified through their study ended up, you know, fitting the definition of warehouse, but, you know, that may or may not be in alignment with what we see down here in San Diego. So that's definitely something that we're going to see if we can, you know, look at and you know, maybe it's surveying a certain subset of those particular facilities to see if they would fit into that definition or not. But yeah, that's going to be one of the more challenging aspects of this until we get to the point where we're you know, either developing a rule or some sort of process to kind of require that sort of reporting.
Okay, I see a comment in the chat from Craig Benedetto. I'll just go ahead and read it for the purposes of the recording here. So, will the revised report come before the board's discussion on proceeding with an ISR or after? It should come before, even if it impacts the timeline. To echo Michelle's comments, what's clear from this presentation is that we really need more and better data. This is potentially a very impactful moment for the regulated community, and getting it right versus relying on best guesses would seem to be the proper approach. We would stand ready to help in information gathering, but the onus shouldn't just be back on the industry to come up with other data sets to inform the decision. And thank you, Greg, for the comment. It is my intent. I would like to have that report be made available, you know, prior to the board weighing in on that decision. That is similar to the approach that we took with the previous ISR framework, where we had that document made available for public comment for some time before the board meeting itself. I can't recall how many weeks, but there was a few weeks there where we did allow and open that up for public review so that everybody had a chance to take a look at the data included. So that is definitely what I would like to pursue again, moving ahead here. I see another comment from Nicholas Paul. From my understanding, this data is more conservative than what would come out in a future SANDAG study, given that it's post-pandemic and warehouse activity has grown in San Diego County over time. Did I miss something? To your point, Nicholas, that is kind of our assumption going in, is that, you know, we believe that there's probably more trucking activity occurring just given the pandemic cycle and what we've heard kind of anecdotally, and also looking at MFAC reports and truck activity at the state level. You know, that's kind of on a countywide basis. It's not really drilled down to the level that we're looking at, you know, in the SANDAG level data that we have. But, you know, overall, we're seeing some increase. We have seen increases in trucking activity coming out of the pandemic. And given that this data was a vintage 2016, we think that's probably going to be the case. We think this data is probably a conservative analysis, and that if we do get new data coming in from SANDAG later this summer or beyond, that it's possible that this data could actually show greater impact or greater truck activity, you know, moving ahead. So that again, it's kind of a presumption at this point, but that is something we'll be looking at moving forward as we see more data kind of trickling out from SANDAG. I see a comment from Andrew Aguilar. As a behavior-based model, population is critical and has potential second, third, and fourth order effects that will impact the results. It's the butterfly effect. Thank you for the comment, Andrew. One thing we did want to just note too is behind the scenes, because Andrew was, if people recall the presentation that and the analysis that Andrew did, which was alluded to a few minutes ago, Andrew presented at our last meeting. You know, in looking at Caltrans data, so the real Caltrans real truck count data in his analysis. One thing we've been looking to do kind of behind the scenes is looking at and just confirming that, looking at some specific data points throughout the region and looking at the Caltrans real traffic data in a certain spot, and then looking at the corresponding SANDAG model data, and trying to see how far or how far away, or if not, how close they are to one another. We've done a little bit of that so far. And so far our numbers are roughly jiving with what we're seeing in terms of the real traffic count data from 2016, 22, I think the 2016 era is what we were looking at to correspond with the 2016 model data, just for consistency. And what we were seeing was really pretty close. You know, there's of course going to be some outliers here and there, but with the couple we've already looked at so far, we were feeling pretty confident that that the nuances between those two approaches are pretty similar. So that's something we can probably share at a future meeting, or potentially wrap up into this report as well, that we'll be working on moving ahead. So we understand that that's a concern in terms of model data versus real truck count data, and just making sure that that's addressed. Are there any other comments, questions? Is there anything that you thought you liked? Is there anything that you didn't like out of the data? Understandably, this is kind of the first cut of what we were doing here. We put a lot of work into this, and understandably, you know, there's going to be probably no perfect solution. However, this is probably the first attempt at something that's kind of on a localized basis of what we're trying to do here and what our board has asked us to do, which is not a simple task. So, you know, we wanted to definitely get some feedback from everyone today. Tim, I see your hand up again.
Yeah, thanks. And one more suggestion, I guess. The slides 21 through 24, there's a big table with like the average size. Let me just choose one of them. Yeah, so
truck
the
trip
four,
rates, yeah.
yeah, the truck trip rates. I think one more column at the risk of, adding too much information would just be like the number of warehouses or number of facilities in each of these size categories. So like, for example, International Border Community, the number of facilities within that 100,000 square foot bucket or the 50,000 to 100,000 square foot bucket. I think you presented that in the presentation last month, but just having it in this table also would be helpful to get an idea of maybe how much an outlier would sway some of these averages. If there's only like, a handful of 100,000 square foot facilities, then that might, a really big one or a really small one might have an effect on what we're seeing for the number of truck trips. Yeah, that's my.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. That's a good comment. We can certainly kind of construct that moving forward and add that for comparison purposes. That's a good suggestion. I think we can do that. We have that data, I believe, so that shouldn't be too big of a lift to do. Appreciate it. So again, I'll ask the question again, just to make sure. We have lots of time, so I want to make sure we have enough time to hear from everybody on this. Are there any aspects of the study you agree with, find interesting? Are there any aspects that you feel require more analysis or disagree with? We've already heard some suggested improvements, some areas to look at. So I just want to understand any more comments that may be coming in. I see Craig Benedetto and then Nicholas Powell.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It's really hard to react to that question because, as we've talked about the data, whether it's accurate, whether it's appropriate, it really comes down to what you're going to use it for ultimately, and what does it mean to the impacted user, the impacted community, the regulated community. So for our members, we really want to know, frankly, for the tenants, what does it mean? And it's really hard to do that without actually having the data having data that is accurate, right? And to the point that Andrew was making, if you have truck trips going in and around and emissions caused by something other than truck trips going to and from a warehouse, but yet you create a rule that then creates some big mitigation program or in lieu fee for the tenant in that particular building. I mean, that could be a pretty big thing. So to ask whether we like or don't like, it really comes down to whether the data is accurate and what the ultimate rule is going to look like and what the impact to the end user is going to be. What we're trying to do is make sure that we don't create a system by which you push out users in our region further away because they don't like the answer that's given from the district, right? You create a rule that creates a massive mitigation requirement or a massive in lieu fee requirement that then just makes a decision-making from these users to either leave the region, leave the state, or move their operations further out to create more truck trips, more vehicle miles traveled, more greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really hard to react to it. And I just want to say that because I don't want anybody to assume that the regulated community is ambivalent to what you're saying, right? I think the reaction will come maybe at the next meeting, maybe at the meeting after that, where you start getting to what this actually means.
Understood. Thanks for the comment, Greg. Let's see. I see Nicholas Powell and then Michelle Jerome.
Hi, Nick. Thanks for the presentation, you and Randy. I have a question about, it's actually the slide that Tim was pointing to. I'm trying to understand it a little more. It's like 24. There we go. Yeah. So I'm trying to understand this. Is this saying the smaller the warehouse, the more daily truck traffic? Is that kind of like a accurate?
Not quite. And others can chime in if they want, but really what we're trying to say, and there's a kind of a series of slides, the 21 through 24 kind of has the analysis we did in different areas, the port side, border, the different clusters and the regional clusters of warehouses that we know of. And then this is the county overall, which is kind of taking everything together. I think the reason why, I think that the key point here is that APCD we're pretty confident in the truck trip rates when we're looking at truck floor areas 50,000 and above. In looking at the comparisons and looking at the other truck trip rate analysis we've seen both at South Coast and those studies that were done, and looking at truck trip rates at under 1, that seems to be the rough number that seems to make that gives us the most confidence, I guess. And we were seeing those numbers 50,000 in square foot and above. Now, when you start looking at, like on this particular slide, there's truck trip rates of over 1 in regards to the heavy duty trucks. When you start going under that total, so going down from 25 down to 12 and then under 12, it doesn't necessarily correspond to what we're thinking is happening. Is that there's definitely some noise in the data happening in the way that the data was constructed, because the numbers start getting thrown off a bit as the square footages start to decrease. And in some cases, the number of corresponding truck trips to a certain location just simply don't make sense when you get down to a really small warehouse level. So that's where the correlation coefficients that we were talking about at the beginning start to kind of, we kind of look at this a little bit more statistically to see what gives us the greatest degree of confidence in the data that we're looking at. Right now, we feel pretty confident in the 50,000 and above. Anything below that, in looking at the truck trip rates and the corresponding daily truck trips that are calculated as a result, we don't have as much confidence in. And that's where we're saying we may have to get real data coming in to really know what are the truck trips that are coming in and out of those smaller facilities. And in those examples that we provided, there really isn't a lot of data out there when it comes to warehouse locations of that small size. Most of the studies have all been done at 100,000 square foot and above. It's really kind of an unknown right now what the truck trip rates are at that smaller location. I'm not sure if I answered your question, Nicholas. If I didn't, correct me if I just went off base there. But
No, yeah, that was helpful, Nick. I think I'm still kind of wrapping my head around these slides, but I appreciate the explanation.
And if there's other APCD staff that want to jump in if I butchered something, let me know. But
Yeah, Nick, if I may add, just kind of to what
sure.
you said, the difference between the orange and then the green that you see in the table, the orange is a truck trip rate, and it's based on 1,000 square foot floor area, whereas the green is the actual daily truck trips, the number of trucks that you're getting at that particular facility, assuming that you're at that average size warehouse. So to answer Nicholas's question, it's not necessarily that the number of trips increase as you go smaller. It's just that the rate per 1,000 square feet does. So you can kind of see generally going from 25,000 all the way down to below 12,500 is the trend goes down, for heavy duty trucks. The far right column goes from 39 daily truck trips to 28 to 12. So those are all calculated based on the average warehouse size, but the rates increase. You're going from looking at the orange column, HHD 1.06, 1.54, 2.17. And the reason why we have less confidence in these particular numbers isn't that they're incorrect per se, but because they are simply out of the range of other reference sources. So that's why we presented, ITE study, what South Coast came up with, just as a point of comparison to see how close are our numbers that we're getting to those numbers. And it's not to say that these numbers in excess of 1 are wrong, but we would need more data to verify if in fact it is correct, or is it off base, or what have you. So I hope that answers your question.
Michelle.
Hi. Well, first, I want to say I agree with Craig's comment about good data being very important in this process. And I also want to ask, is this because the next agenda item is next steps? How are you planning to assess the effect of CARB's regulations on medium and heavy duty trucks in this rulemaking process? Because there have been a few very important ones that were passed recently. And, you know, as we know in Health and Safety Code 40727, you are supposed to make findings of necessity, authority, clarity, consistency, and non-duplication and reference. So non-duplication means that the regulation does not impose the same requirements as an existing state or federal regulation.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. And you're understood. Your knowledge of health and safety code is spot on. So, yeah, we are attempting to really try and pin down the effects of the state regulations versus what if we take a regulatory approach, you know, how that would impact things into making sure that, you know, what benefits are coming out of ACF or ACT versus what would come out of a proposed regulation if that were the intended pathway we take. So that is something that we're attempting to do. Understandably, it's a little difficult to do, and that's something that we're still trying to wrap our heads around and looking at the data. However, this is kind of the first step that we think we need to take to kind of get to that next step, which is to then better understand what are the intended impacts that we're seeing. We kind of took a high level approach with that in our ISR framework and trying to characterize that information in terms of the impacts that we're getting from state regulations versus if we did a regulation for San Diego for warehouses. This would be, I think if we were able to do it, this would be a little bit more of a robust analysis in looking at a San Diego specific data, which is what we're setting this up to be. The other one, there was a lot of assumptions being made. So we'll have to go back and look and see, you know, what we're able to do there. But yes, that is something on our radar to do. Understandably, it's a little difficult to do, but we understand that it's something that we need to attempt to do.
Okay, I just want to also say that it is very difficult for the regulated community to have a few regulations that have overlapping requirements.
Understood. Tim.
Thank you. I was just digging more into or thinking about the truck counts and how those are applied, like in a table like this. So in order to get the truck rates, you're dividing the number of truck trips by the average warehouse size. And so the number of truck trips, I think Randy mentioned or showed on the screen, that was the street segments. So the number of trucks on a particular street segment, were you only looking at like the non-freeway segments, for example? Or was there like a geographic like aggregation, for example, like over a traffic analysis zone or some other type of geography? And then I guess one other thing is, if you have multiple warehouse sizes, a really big one next to a small one on the same block, how are the truck trips kind of like allocated to those different facilities, for example? And I kind of assumed that you didn't do this on like a facility by facility basis because you've got hundreds of them to analyze, but maybe you could just share more about the methodology either here or in further reporting that you do that will go to the board eventually.
Yeah, Randy, do you want to try and answer some of those?
Yes. So to your first point, Tim, about did we look at the freeways? The answer is no. We tried to concentrate on the actual side streets that would be near a warehouse. So what we did with GIS's assistance was we searched for similar size warehouses that are served by a nearby street segment. So say, for example, look on the search for 100,000 square foot and above. So the search looked at, you know, the map, and it grabbed the various you know, street segments that met that criteria, and it did an aggregate. So we're not looking at a per warehouse basis, but as an aggregate, the total sum of the warehouses on that street segment, in addition to the total truck volume along that street segment. But then it did a search for everywhere within that particular cluster. So for example, for Kearney Mesa, the search did it throughout that particular cluster. And so when we got the information back from GIS, we did a table to do an aggregate of all those searches. So you know, so in the table, if you're looking at 100,000 and above, what we did was we took at the total aggregate square footage of those warehouses meeting that criteria, and the total aggregate truck volume, and that's what gave us the average floor area, because we knew the number of warehouses that were in that search, in addition to using that information to find out the truck trip rate, because we had an aggregate area, we had an aggregate volume, and that hence gave us the truck trip rate per 1,000 square foot. So that's kind of how we did it. And we did it for each size category. So 100,000 and above, then we cut that in half, 50,000 to 100,000, so on and so forth. But all those numbers that you see are all aggregate. So that's why it's basically an average for that particular cluster. So we did that for, you know, Kearney Mesa, Poway, the various 10 that we mentioned in the previous slides. In addition to, hey, let's take a look at the county. What was the county doing? So that's why we did the multiple tables, the port side, international border, just the clusters, but excluding 3 specific ones: Poway, Kearney Mesa, and I believe it's Carlsbad and Vista, because their correlations weren't as strong compared to the other clusters. And then in addition to county, but looking at everything, including those clusters that were excluded in the previous slide, just as a way of comparison. So we did that just to see how good is the data, and then 2, what are the truck trip rates specific to these clusters, just as a point of comparison. So again, as we mentioned at the very beginning, these are all preliminary. Nothing is set in stone. All of these numbers will change depending on the assumptions used. So if a higher percentage of the truck flow volume is instead not, you know, 12.5% that we are saying, but in fact higher, that would change the numbers. In addition to, okay, if it's not 30% of the warehouse floor area, it's actually less, say 20%, 10%, then your truck trip rates will increase, because your area that you're dividing it by is getting smaller. So all of these factors come into play, and that's what makes it difficult at this point to pin down finalized numbers, because it really depends. What are our assumptions? Are they reasonable? And the way that we check these assumptions, again, by looking at those other sources, and from what we can tell, based on the assumptions that were described today, they look reasonable 50,000 and above, because they're within range. And once you go below it, there's less confidence, because the rates are, you know, 1 point something, 2 point something, 3. You're talking about orders of magnitude away from other reference sources.
Great, thanks. And then just one final comment. It seems, and it's obviously this is more than what you have access to with the CoStar, but it seems like the purpose of the warehouse, like a distribution center versus cold storage or parcel hub, that seems like the use really has more of an effect on what the trip rate would be than just the footprint, the size. And so, you know, you don't have that available with your data, but it kind of seems like there isn't like a logical explanation that would necessarily, you know, explain all of the different variation in truck trip rates that you get across the different areas. But other than something like the use of the kind of like a more specific use of the warehouse, that's just one other comment. Thanks.
Let's see, Andrew.
Thanks, Nick. And Michelle actually raised a good point about wanting to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts necessarily, and kind of opened up the greater question in my mind of kind of what's what's the rate of return that we can expect on the investment, especially on such a heavily regulated space already. And so the thought occurred to me is if maybe, we could even sort of reframe this discussion altogether and suggest, is there a gap analysis done for light duty vehicles or vehicles under the gross vehicle weight rating of 8,500 pounds, such that they would qualify as light duty vehicles? Because I think I've seen it doesn't pass the red face test to me to suggest that medium and heavy duty traffic would be significantly higher than light duty. Occam's razor would suggest that there would be possibly even an order of magnitude more traffic from these lighter vehicles that are still passing through the same disaffected communities, disadvantaged communities, that could potentially then that could be an avenue to look at and explore, if not from a rule perspective, maybe certainly from an incentive perspective that we can look at. So it's just something that occurred to me, that if the concern from a regulatory perspective is that we might be retreading the same path and not necessarily using resources to the best ability that we could be, maybe there's other options and that we can explore. And I wanted to open that up.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I mean, that was one of the purposes of this group in coming up at the start was, looking at all the options that are out there. We're still looking at a number of options that we can potentially go down, both in the regulatory and non-regulatory space. I would encourage everyone that's listening into this meeting and others who may be viewing on the recording. We're still looking at all the options that are on the table, and if there's other options that we would like to consider, or other avenues, other data sets, this is all something that we're in kind of a phase of things where we're looking to kind of get whatever information we can. That's something that we will try to encapsulate as much as we can into this report that we end up going to our board for later this year or early next year. So it's definitely something that we hear, and we'd encourage everybody to continue reaching out to us with any feedback and information that you can. I see Nicholas Powell's comment in the chat. It says, thank you for the presentation. Seeing slide 24 made me think about neighborhoods with concentrations of smaller warehouses near sensitive receptors. When there are dozens of smaller warehouses within a small area, all of which attract 5 to 15 daily trucks, I can see how diesel truck traffic can quickly add up. Residents in Barrio Logan tell us all the time about heavy-duty, medium-duty truck traffic from warehouses in the neighborhood. And thank you for the comment, Nicholas. We understand that that's an issue, and that's something that I think we're hoping that our analysis, while I don't know if we're going to be able to go to the extent of looking at what I think you're saying is pretty much kind of like a cumulative analysis where you have a lot of smaller warehouses kind of combined that may be going on a particular street. That I'm not sure we're going to be able to get there with this particular analysis and looking at kind of the cumulative impacts of what that might handle as far as like on a particular street segment. However, the comment is noted that there could be disproportionately impacted streets where you have a number of warehouses all on the same street. Whereas one, if all of those get 2 or 3 trucks a day, that street could be disproportionately impacted. So understand the comment there. Is there any other comments, suggestions, feedback? Or I think this might be a good opportunity to move ahead with our final portion of the presentation. And I see, before I do that, I'll just note that Andrew's comment, we should be wary of attributing those trips solely to warehouses. It is very possible, and probability would suggest likely those trucks could be serving other industry sectors. And that is true, Andrew, that there is some assumptions being made that there's a possibility in some cases there might be warehouses, or that truck activity may not be going to in fact warehouses, and that's something we'll have to kind of just further get into as we get into this analysis. So I'll go ahead and kind of go into our next final slide here. Sorry, my daughter is she's getting a little thirsty and hungry, so I apologize. but I'll go ahead and get into the last portion of the presentation. So this is the next step. So we've gotten through this. We've looked at this kind of preliminary truck trip rate analysis, and so these are the things that we'll be working on moving forward from today's meeting. Staff is going to be considering comments from today. We thank you for everyone's feedback today, and then move ahead to looking at finalizing the truck trip rates that we intend to utilize moving forward. Baseline emission reductions, cost effectiveness, they're all going to be calculated to present this information to the governing board later this year or early next year for their consideration. The public health benefits are also going to be estimated, because public health benefits will rely on modeling. Those estimates may be done by consultants who will prepare a corresponding socioeconomic impact assessment report to the board if the board directs the district to develop an ISR rule. So those estimates would be coming at a later date if that's the option they choose to pursue. Staff would also prepare an update and present to the governing board, as mentioned, either later this year or early 2025, and that is the timeline in which we'd like to have a report that kind of captures what we discussed today at a higher, in more detail in black and white, so that we can share it with the WWG and other stakeholders. Understandably, we threw a lot out there, and we hope to provide a little bit more meat on the bone in the coming months ahead with that report. Next slide, please. So if there are any other questions or comments on the next steps, this would be the time to kind of discuss those. We kind of mentioned quite a few of them, I think, throughout the meatier portion of the presentation. So I don't think there was anything quite new there, but if there is any feedback or comments on terms of the next steps of where we're going with this analysis, others that haven't been shared, we heard a lot of feedback already today, which we will certainly look back and try to figure out where we can go with it. This would be the time to just share it. So is there any other comments or questions in regards to our next steps and where we're going with this? See, Andrew, do you have your hand up again, or is that a legacy hand?
Definitely legacy. Sorry about that, Nick.
No problem. Just wanted to double check. All right. I think we got a lot of the comments probably already, so I think this is probably duplicative effort from what we've shared before. So I think at this point, I just wanted to probably move on to the next slide, which is any non-agenda and participant comments. I think we've shared what we wanted to share today in terms of the truck trip rate analysis. Clearly we didn't want to overwhelm everybody with a lot of information. At the same time, we wanted to share what we have at this point, and share it with the WWG and get your feedback, which we do sincerely appreciate everybody's feedback and time and looking at it and staying with us to digest it and understands the complications with it and everything that comes with it. So I do really appreciate it. We don't usually have a lot of time in our agendas for non-agenda items or other participant comments, but this would be a good time to open it up to anybody who wants to provide any comments not in relation to the agenda item that we shared about today, but maybe other comments in regards to the entire process, other things that are also in the works. This would be a good time to share those if there are any. Jack.
Thanks, Nick. I'm kind of going back to that previous question you were asked about anything else we'd like to see going forward. And that would be, I would like to see a discussion of the definition that we are working with for warehouse, such that we could compare it side by side with the CoStar data to ensure that the CoStar data is in fact applicable. I think that's going to be a big question and a big issue if we don't verify that or rule it out one way or the other. here soon, since it seems to be part of a lot of the work you all have already done and how you're overlaying it. So I'd like to see that done soon.
Thanks, Jack. We'll take that comment back and see what we can do on that front.
Okay.
Any other comments? Non-agenda items? Okay. Well, we thought we might wrap up a little early today, and it looks like we might have. So, our next meeting is going to be on Monday, July 1st from 3 to 5. Meeting agenda topics are still being determined, but we're hoping to share a little bit more information start in the next steps of this analysis. We're also thinking about having Sandag come in also as well to potentially share some information about that commercial vehicle survey that we were referencing today. That was a pretty robust survey that they did just 2 years ago. So that would be an interesting data point for us to learn about a little bit more. As a reminder, notifications are sent out to those subscribed to our WWG email service listserv prior to each meeting. So again, encourage everybody to sign up for that. And then you'll get notified of the agenda and the presentations. Those are also up on our website, and they're posted on the Friday before each meeting. So just wanted to make sure that was also known as well. All right. I think that is it. I guess we'll go to the final slide, which is our contact information. Feel free to contact us with any questions at any point. And that concludes for today. So thank you again for joining us, and we'll hope to see you at the next meeting in July. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.